myself Kira, by Niv, who works with students at the University of Southampton. The talk will probably go on for like 50 minutes, so everyone has time to get to their lectures if they need to. And after the talk, there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions. And you can text your questions during the talk. The number's on the screen over there. So yeah, please do that. It'd be really great. So yeah, I'm just going to welcome up Niv now.
Thanks so much for that, Philippa. It's great to see all of you. I'm going to be speaking for about 20 minutes on this topic. And I want to begin with a simple statement. No one has ever seen God. And that is a cause of huge frustration, isn't it? Because some people you speak to are adamant that there is a God and that you can know about them, him, she, it. And others are adamant that there probably isn't a God and you definitely couldn't know a thing like that. And even the experience of the same thing leads different people to conclude in different ways. Perhaps even the title the Christian Union have given this week, Uncover Real Life, feeds that frustration. Because when we're talking about God, how are we to say whether it is real? How do we even know? And things get bigger because we realise that so much hinges on this question. If there is a God who made everything, then access to them would solve so much. Why the ambiguity? Why the game of hide and seek? Why not make yourself clearer, God? Well, I'm here as a Christian who used to be an atheist. And there are so many things I could mention in talking about how clear God is or isn't in the world. For instance, we could talk about our world. We could ask where it came from. Let me share a quote from the awesomely named theoretical physicist Freeman Dyson. What a good name. He says this: as we look out into the universe and identify many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked together to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must, in some sense, have known that we were coming. I studied English at university, and when I talk to my scientific friends, they all agree. It very much seems like the universe knew we were coming. Or we could talk about the way we live. I know this was touched on yesterday, but it's true that we act as moral agents in a moral universe. And we act as if moral values aren't things we've invented, but rather things we discover, pointing to a moral arbiter, people would say. Here's a moment from Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov. One of the characters says, if there's no God, everything's permitted. And yet, no one I know lives that way. Much more to be said about that. Do ask questions if you like. But basically, there would be so much for us to talk about. But since I only have about 20 minutes, I'll rather share with you what convinced me. The evidence that defies ambiguity. That statement I started with, no one has ever seen God, comes from a very surprising place. It doesn't come from an atheist thinker, but actually it comes from the Bible. Let me complete the quotation for you, and you'll also find it in this book on your chairs. It's right near the beginning on page, not quite 1, but 4. And you'll find it there by the little number 18. Here's the quotation. No one has ever seen God. The one and only Son, who is himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. There's a lot going on in those words, perhaps a lot of jargon to us, but don't miss the massive claim at the heart of the Christian faith. No one has ever seen God, but this God has made himself known. And if that's true, it changes everything. Think about it. All our reasoning and religiosity hasn't really settled the matter. It takes us nowhere conclusive. Centuries of civilizations leave us with a range of different answers. But if God has made himself known, then we wouldn't have to think our way up to him as if we could. No, he would have reached down to us. Now that sentence I shared, this book you're holding, is a first century historical document called John's Gospel. It's part of his opening to the book, and I do want to read another couple of sentences. They'll be on the screen. But the first one starts by the very beginning, the big one. John writes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Skip down with me to the 14. He then writes, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The ambiguity-defying claim of the Christian faith is this: God has made himself known, so that people who've never seen him, whose best efforts take them nowhere conclusive, can know him for themselves. How? Because this figure, the Word, who was with God, who was God, who made all things, became flesh. God becoming a person like us with a body and a face and a name. Jesus of Nazareth. Now, is there any reason to take that claim seriously? Well, when I was an atheist, I remember doubting everything I heard about Jesus, and I viewed him the way that you would Zeus or Thor. Except without the cool movie that those guys seem to be getting at the moment. But what you find when you investigate Jesus of Nazareth is a historical figure. We wonder, well, can we know if Jesus lived? No historian doubts it. The impact he had was world-changing, and the evidence attesting to his life and deeds widespread. You can find historians like Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Flavius Josephus, all writing within 100 years of his public life, all testifying to the impact he had. But we can go even further back than that. The writings that form what we call the New Testament are dated incredibly early. We've got 4 accounts of Jesus' life. This one, John's Gospel, is one of them. And historians date these to within 30 to 60 years of Jesus' public life. Not only do they enjoy widespread attestation among other first-century writings, but they claim to feature eyewitness testimony. They claim to be people who were actually there, telling us what they actually saw and heard. And we can go even further back than that. The earliest of all the Christian writings were written by a man named Paul, who wrote these letters to early Christian communities, and these are dated to within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' public life. They contain so much information about him. They also feature eyewitness testimony. They have a markedly high view of Jesus as more than just a human being or a prophet, but in fact divine. And they make explicit and repeated reference to Jesus dying and then rising again. In short, the idea that Jesus is mainly mythical, or even that his legacy was cooked up later by eager followers, doesn't fit with the evidence that we have. The gap between Jesus' public life and this proliferation of his teachings is far too small for myth-making. For one thing, plenty of people would have been there to deny what was being said, because these claims were so easy to falsify. And even though much of what was written in the ancient world has been lost, when we look at the earliest evidence for Jesus today, we have an embarrassment of riches before us to make our investigation. The earliest of all the fragments I've actually put up there on the screen. It's actually called Papyrus 52, and because of the way the Greek is written, scholars date it to AD 125. You can find that in Manchester in the Rylands Library, and it comes from this book, John's Gospel, which means that just 35 years after the text was written, we have a physical fragment of it. And it was found in Egypt, far, far away from where it was originally written. You see that these writings about Jesus are abundantly well attested in a way that no other ancient literature actually is. I've got a chart up for us to see. Perhaps it's too small for us to read, but the point that it makes is this. When you look at other ancient literature, the gap between when they were written and our first physical copy of them is vast. But not so with the writings about Jesus. The gap is much smaller. And when you look at these other writings, the number of copies we have by which we can ascertain what was originally wrote is minuscule. But not so with the early writings about Jesus. We have so much to work with. That doesn't mean that what the Bible says about Jesus is automatically true, but it does mean this. When we look at these early writings, we are dealing with solid history. These are sources that are very well corroborated, as well as archaeological insights, historical study of places and names and other things continue to show and underline the trustworthiness of these texts. Now, some of us might be instinctively suspicious of taking Christian writings at face value. We might wonder, well, won't they just be biased? Don't they contain accounts of miracles that nobody here has ever seen today? Well, there's so much to be said about that. They do contain accounts of things we have to call miraculous. Here are a couple of things to say about that. Firstly, in all of the critique and condemnation of the Christian faith, which was widespread in the first 2 centuries, none of the people attacking Jesus and his followers ever denied that he did miracles or sorcery or wondrous works. Whatever they called them, not even the opponents denied that Jesus did these things. Secondly, and maybe more seriously, we can't just reject the accounts because of the miracles. That would be an example of some pretty dreadful circular reasoning. If we decide, before we investigate Jesus, what is or is not possible for him to do, how open-minded are we really being? If we make an a priori dismissal of the miraculous, we've decided the answer before looking at the evidence. And can I say, no amount of clarity from God would ever help us if we took that approach. Before I move on, let me make this point about bias. Early Christians definitely were biased. They definitely did write with an agenda, and they're even happy to tell you what it is if you read their writings. But I think that makes them excellent historical evidence. For one thing, everyone has an agenda. Everyone who writes history has a bias. But for another, history is normally written by the winners. That's what we're used to. People who have authority and the comfort of belonging to a privileged place. But that's not what you find in the New Testament. When you read the earliest Christian writings, you're reading history written by the losers. You're reading people prepared to put their names and reputations to a message that was deeply unpopular. The Jewish nation in which Christianity was born was utterly hostile to this upstart messianic cult. And the Roman Empire in which it grew became more and more violent in its suppression of this movement. What we have when we read these writings is the testimony of people who had nothing to gain by writing what they wrote, and stood to lose their lives for standing by what they said, as many of them did. This is history written by the losers. I think that makes it uniquely credible. The truth about Jesus is a matter of history. And somehow this man managed to become such a central figure to our thinking that we literally measure history around his life. And the question I've got to ask is, what was it about him? Well, when you look at Jesus, you find a person like no other. The impact he had on people was extraordinary and undeniable. And this week, we at the Christian Union would love to invite you to assess him, to look at him and see for yourself what you make, what kind of person we're discussing, to go to the eyewitness evidence and see what you make of Jesus. We're giving away these accounts, John's Gospel. It's first century, it's first hand, and we would love you to have it. This is a gift from the Christian Union to you, so please take it away and look at it. I personally could not recommend doing that more. I started investigating Jesus as an atheist, utterly sceptical about him, all the possibilities of any religion. But what I found was something extraordinary. This is what you find when you look at the Jesus of history. You find a person who drew huge crowds with thousands of people longing to hear from him, desperate to hear from him. And yet, you find that he never did just the thing they wanted. In fact, he was prepared to lose followers rather than be co-opted to anyone else's agendas or play by their rules. Everyone wanted a piece of him, but he was in no one's pocket. Last week, I was at Sussex University doing something like this, and someone told me that they were sure that the Christian faith was a psychological projection, people telling themselves what they want to hear. But look at Jesus, and you find him refusing to conform at nearly every point with what people want to hear. You'll also find a person who taught like no other teacher. His teaching has shaped ethical systems, permeated cultures, and even professed unbelievers would tell you that Jesus exemplifies the highest and best of human ideals. But it's not just that he was a teacher. You also find that he was no hypocrite. He sets this high standard, but then lives it out himself. One of the scandalous things Jesus told his followers to do was to forgive their enemies. And then when his enemies nailed him to a cross, he prayed, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Total integrity. You find someone who treated people in the most remarkable way breaking down social boundaries everywhere he went. In a time of unquestioned and unchecked sexism, you find Jesus calling women to follow him and making them a key part of his witness to the world. In a prurient and judgmental society, you find Jesus speaking gently to the outcast and rejected. He didn't suck up to the rich, he didn't look down on the poor. Old people and very young people loved being around him. This is no Cecil Rhodes we're talking about. We're not embarrassed about any part of his life, because it's beautiful, in a way no other life has ever been. But, for all that humility, you also find someone who said staggering, outrageous things. Literally outrageous, because the people who first heard them wanted to kill him for saying them. And when you read Jesus' claims, you'll see they are arrogant beyond description, if they're not true. Every other religious teacher comes as a messenger from God, there to point you the way toward God. But Jesus comes claiming to be the way to God himself. He actually said that. You read on in this book, you'll find him saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one goes to the Father except through me. You find that Jesus accepted worship, which only God is supposed to get. He goes around forgiving people's sins, which only God is supposed to do. He doesn't leave us many options. We may want to call him a moral teacher and nothing more, but he's unabashed in presenting himself as so much more than that. That's what you start to find when you look at the Jesus of history. You find a person whom every thinking person should assess. Let me put it this way. What would you have to do to change the world? And what would you need to do? Well, given the raw ingredients of only 3 years in the public eye, 12 haphazard and incompetent friends, the backwater of Galilee with nothing much going on there, no money to spend, no armies to lead, and at the end of it, a public, humiliating execution, Jesus began a movement that is growing at a staggering rate even today. 2 billion people, and counting, call this homeless carpenter's son God. How do you explain it? What does this mean for us? Well, if what Jesus says about himself is true, then that tells us something remarkable. The truth would be that Jesus is God coming to find us, putting the ambiguities aside and making himself clear. Not playing hide and seek, or if he is playing hide and seek, playing it terribly badly. Like the toddlers I once had the privilege of working with. Play hide and seek with a toddler, they will instantly run out of their hiding place. I'll say, here I am! And if God is playing hide and seek, he is just as bad, if not worse, as those toddlers. Because here Jesus is, at the centre of history, reaching down to us, offering love, hope, and security to a dark, cynical, and fragile world. And Jesus and his early followers are adamant that he offers these things in a more than metaphorical way. And they pointed to his widely witnessed bodily resurrection from the dead to justify that claim. Come back on Friday at lunchtime, we'll be looking at the evidence for that. But can I ask you now, will you investigate this? These aren't empty assertions or mere opinions, these are claims that you can test. You get to see for yourself. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Because the evidence is early and reliable, and it points towards Jesus being who he says he is. And if that's true, then it's the best possible news. It means that God wants to know you. He's not content to stay abstract in your life. He doesn't want to remain a mere concept. We may not think about him much ourselves, but he has come forward in the most remarkable way to make himself known by becoming one of us, the Creator, stepping into his creation, the author of reality, writing himself into the story, deciding to make our home his home, our problems his problems, to come as near to us as he possibly could by becoming one of us. And this is wonderful. God has chosen to make himself known in a way all of us could readily understand. Think about it. If God made himself known primarily in mystical experiences, then those of us here who don't feel that spiritual wouldn't stand a chance. If God made himself known in super difficult, abstruse philosophical propositions, then those of us here who aren't that smart wouldn't ever be able to know him really. And if he'd done those
things, then God would show the thing he cared about us most for was our spiritual capacity or intellectual ability. But when we look at Jesus, we see something different. Jesus shows us a God who doesn't just value your spiritual capacity or intellectual ability, he values you. And he doesn't want your religious observance or your good behaviour. He wants you. And so he doesn't give you a list of rules to follow or a formula to puzzle over. He gives you himself. That's the astonishing thing the Bible says about human beings. That each of us were made by God, to know God and be known by God, to value him and be valued by him. And it says that all of our restlessness and striving and dissatisfaction comes from us not knowing him like that, being apart from him. But even when we are apart, Jesus shows us a God who cares about us enough to come to us, even when we could never reach him. He shows us a God who cares enough about you to step down. He didn't come to earth in a chariot, but chose to side with the oppressed and the weak and came to earth in a crib. He didn't surround himself with servants, bowing and scraping, but chose the life of a refugee, because that's how desperately he wants to know you. That's how desperately he wants you to know him. Jesus steps onto the world stage with an extraordinary and world-changing offer of love, one that billions over history have come to accept, one that shows that even though we may not be so interested in him, God is interested in us, and scandalously opens himself up to investigation, so that your inquiring minds and massive questions and meaningful objections aren't shunned by him but welcomed by him. So whoever you are this lunchtime, can I urge you to investigate Jesus yourself? He isn't like any other historical figure, because no other historical figure in their right mind ever claimed for themselves the things Jesus did. And no other historical figure accomplished as much to change the world, especially starting with so little. So please do make up your mind about him. Please do dig into this eyewitness account we're looking at. Please do come back tonight and tomorrow and find out more. Thank you so much for listening to me so patiently. I have one more thing I'd love you to do before we go into a bit of Q&A time. And do be texting on if you've got more questions. Could you all grab this response form? You all have one on your chairs. The Christian Union are putting on this week of events, and we're still only on Tuesday. We would love to know anything you've got to say that would help us to do this better. And you'll see there's a little section called feedback. So please would you write down there any feedback you have, even if it was good talk, or I'm unconvinced by the speaker's hair, or whatever it was. Put it down, we'd love to hear it. And also, we'd love to give you a chance to think further about some of the things I've mentioned. And we'd love to get in touch with you about that. So do put down your name, your contact details. And let me explain these three boxes we have. At the top there, we have something called Christianity Explored, a group which pretty much is what it says on the tin, and Tiffany will come and say a bit more about that in a moment. Below that, we've got a box called Count Me In. And if you've decided, listening to what I've said, and you've been thinking about these things before, if you decide that you want Jesus to be part of your life, the way that I and other Christians know him to be, that box is for you, do tick it. And down there at the bottom, we have a box that says, tell me more, please, if you'd like to find out more, if you'd like to take things a bit further. Let me be really bold. I think every thinking person owes it to themselves to figure out if Jesus stacks up to the things he said. If true, even though it feels like we're looking for God, the truth is, he's been looking for us. And I'd love you guys to find out more about that. Thanks so much. Tiffany, do you want to come up and mention a bit about Christianity?